how standards have and still can really change the world. But I'm also going to take you on a little bit of my journey of how I got here. It's going to start in a desert in China, and it's going to wind up in a nonprofit called SASB in the Bay Area. So, and a lot of twists and turns in between. But again, it's just a real pleasure to be able to be in such an esteemed group. So again, thanks for the opportunity. So as I mentioned, my journey in sustainability really began on a trip that, a different kind of trip that I took when I was, a few decades ago at this point. And as many good stories do, this trip began on a train. It was in the early 90s in Western China, and I was traveling from a city called Urumqi to a town called Dunhuang, which is an oasis town on the old Silk Road. A friend of mine was doing research on Buddhist cave paintings from the Tang Dynasty, as one does. And I was living and working in Japan at the time, and she invited me to visit her in these caves, which was a really extraordinary experience because since they've been closed to tourists and they've been replicated as sort of like, here's what they look like, but you can't go inside the real thing. So I was able to go in the real thing. But to get there was a real journey, and I had to fly in order to get into the Gobi, which is where Dunhuang is. I had to first fly to Urumqi and then take an overnight train to Dunhuang. So it was fantastic journey that opened my eyes in many, many ways. At the time, I was working for an investment bank called Salomon Brothers in Japan. Salomon Brothers has since fallen of its own hubris, but that's a whole other webinar. But I wasn't in sustainability. I think sustainability had emerged as a concept or a word or a movement around the same time, but I was not in that field at all. I was, out there visiting a friend of mine on this epic journey. And as we began to leave Urumqi and enter the Taklak Makan, I can never say that, the Taklak Makan desert, which literally means enter and don't emerge in probably Turkish. It was really extraordinary. And as I peered out the window from my seat, sort of taking it all in, I began seeing things fly past the window, and they weren't birds. I then explored further and discovered that the staff, the crew on the train were literally disposing of the train's trash by throwing it from the train into the desert. So that was the first of several wake-up calls that I had on that trip. You can see here how the desert, and this is one of millions of photos of this situation, how the desert is literally just cluttered with plastic waste. There are stories of camels dying as birds do from ingesting plastic waste. So that was my first wake-up call. And there were many more. I'm also, as many people are, I'm really, I respond very negatively to particulate matter in the air, and there is a lot of it in China. And this was my first trip to China. So it occurred to me on this trip that if China was revving up its industrial engines, as it was after decades of communist slumber, that the region was certainly in for a lot of environmental degradation, and that we were going to need to do something different. So I was pretty dissatisfied in my role at Salomon Brothers and was looking for a way to transition careers. I don't have a science background. I don't have an engineering background, but I was really interested in getting into the solution side of things. I wanted to get into renewable energy. Unfortunately, it was about 20 years ahead of its time when it comes to cost curves that made it viable. I then subsequently worked in a nonprofit that is working towards keeping forested lands forested. I've worked in clean tech and all over the place. But one of the things that is a through line for all of these things that we need, and we need all of them, that we need to improve the quality of life, not to mention staving off climate change as we move forward, is capital. So it gets me right back to where I started. I left Salomon Brothers shortly after that trip to get an MBA. So that was the only way that I could really envision transitioning from my work into sustainability because I didn't have a science or an engineering background. And it seemed like a logical solution to many problems. And it was a really fantastic decision. But again, it led me right back to finance. So that's sort of like where I started, how I wound up back talking to a bunch of investors, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. So that's kind of the backdrop for my story. And a lot has changed on that journey. A lot has changed in my personal life, in my professional life. Nonetheless, climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our time, and I think every member of this group is painfully aware of that. And we've seen many leaders emerge in the battle against climate change. So Christiana Figueres, Catherine Hayhoe, Greta Thunberg. These are some of the three badass women I think of when I think of climate leadership. Who do you think of when you think of climate leadership? I think of the founders of this group, for example, and countless diverse women who joined it. So those come to mind, but chances are that past chairs of the Securities Exchange Commission are probably not at the top of your list of people when you think of climate leadership. But I want to explain to you a little bit more in our presentation today about why they should be, and why standards are a really important tool that we have at our disposal now for improving corporate disclosure on performance on issues related to climate change, as well as other sustainability issues. But I'm going to take you back a little bit to the world before standards. And this is the image on the right. I'm sorry, it's painful, but it's kind of meant to be painful. This is an image of what screws looked like before they were standardized, before you could go and buy like hundreds of the same size screw and, you know, like match them at Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever you buy your hardware. Screws were handcrafted, and the quality of the screws were dependent on the eye and the skill of the craftsman. They were customized and not interchangeable, and that hindered scaling, right? So you couldn't just say, we're going to build out, you know, X, Y, or Z. So after standards, screws are independent from the eye and the skill of the craftsman. They're easily interchanged and they enable scaling. So why is that a big deal? Well, without standardized screws, for example, we wouldn't have precision instrumentation. And without precision instrumentation, we wouldn't have a lot of the systems we take for granted in our lives, including the infrastructure and systems that we use every day in our daily lives, maybe less so since we've all been in lockdown for who knows how long. But the infrastructure that we rely on in our everyday lives really is dependent on a lot of standardization. And that's sort of like the unsung hero of a lot of what we take for granted in our modern world. So this is, for example, this looks a lot like the train I was on and the journey that I talked to you about in the journey that I began into sustainability through the desert. But it's now been replaced by high-speed rail, again, which never would have been possible without standardization, a bunch of smart engineers. But infrastructure in many of our systems need to change. This is actually taken from the New York Times. During the first few days of blackouts in California related to wildfires here a few years ago. So I thought it was very evocative of like, you know, like stop. We desperately need to change. We need to rethink our infrastructure. We need to think the way that we work and respond and cultivate so many things in a rapidly changing and complex world. So here is just, you know, headlines from natural disasters related to climate change, as well as some other ESG factors, environmental, social, and governance, for those of you who aren't familiar with that shorthand. But when it comes to disclosure, corporate disclosure on issues related to long-term value, including climate risk, we've literally been looking at that world through a peephole. And what do I mean by that? In part, you know, financial statements, which is one of the standardized tools that investors use for gathering their data, really don't capture the full picture anymore. So back in the 70s, you know, 83% of a company's assets were visible, touchable, palpable. They were tangible assets. You could visit the factory, you could count the inventory, you could touch it and feel it. or experience it. That has absolutely been flipped on its head. So today, over 90% of the assets of a company, companies on the S&P 500, their market value is attributable to intangible assets. You can't touch or feel it. It's things like goodwill, it's IP, it's a lot of things that have great value, but investors are really trying to figure out like what's in there. Along with that is a lot of reputational risk that can easily degrade the value of a company literally overnight in some cases. So there's tremendous interest in getting better information, standardized information. We'll talk more about that in a minute, about how companies are managing issues that we all care a lot about, including climate risk. So sustainability reporting has grown, incredibly over the last several decades. So over 90% of major large cap companies, certainly, and most companies are issuing some sort of sustainability report, but it's really falling short of investor needs, not because it's bad or badly intentioned. It's very well intentioned, but it's really designed for other audiences. It's not designed for investors who are grappling with data. They're big consumers of data and market data services. One of the reasons that ESG disclosure is falling short of investor needs is that most of it is binary. It's a yes/no answer to a question like, do you have a policy in place about climate risk in your operations? Do you have a policy in place about labor conditions in your supply chain? Yes, no. So years ago, that might have been helpful for investors to say, oh, they don't have a policy in place. What's going on there? But fast forward to 2021, investors are very savvy about the ability of these things to affect the value of a company, as well as, not to mention, of course, impacts on society and societal outcomes. So investors want to know, what are you doing with that policy? They want data associated with the actions that you're taking. Another problem with information that's available is that without standards, companies are using an array of metrics to describe the same thing. So it's depriving investors of comparable, consistent, reliable data. This is an excerpt from something that was published in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance in 2019 about 4 things no one will tell you about ESG data, which I love the title of because it's very provocative, but it's very revealing. So these academics took a look at how 50 randomly chosen large cap companies were disclosing on the single topic of employee health and safety. And what they discovered is that those 50 companies were using 24 different metrics to describe how they were managing employee health and safety in their companies. Why is that a problem? Well, it's because those metrics were in different units of measure. Some were numeric, some were ratios, others were percentages. And so when those different metrics are put into distributions, we find that we have different top and bottom performers in standard deviations associated with mean value. And so then you have laggards overlapping with leaders on the same topic, which results in what is a pain point for many companies as well as investors, which is a problem that it's not standardized. It's dependent on the eye and the skill of the craftsman who is reading the information. It is often customized, and it hinders the comparability and the use at scale, which sounds an awful lot like to the problem that we talked about with screws before they were standardized. It's very challenging for investors to use this information. ESG rating and rankings companies have, sort of a gold mine on their hands where they are evaluating the performance of companies on these factors. But we have literally a dog's breakfast when it comes to the lack of correlation between what the ratings and rankings companies divine about company performance on these factors. So this is from the Wall Street Journal, I can't remember what year, where they took a look at how the ratings and rankings companies took the same company and had very different overviews and ratings of those companies and their ESG performance. So again, this leaves investors, with a huge problem and a giant elephant in our room. So investors have really become much more savvy about why they should be taking a look at these factors. Back in the 70s, a small group of investors petitioned the SEC for better disclosure, for mandated disclosure on sustainability factors. And at the time, the SEC said, there aren't enough of you who care about this, and so we're not going to mandate it. And we see today, we've got SASB has over 70 trillion investors with over 70 trillion US dollars in assets under management who want standardized data, who are asking for SASB disclosure. There are over 100 trillion in investors with assets under management of 100 trillion, who are signatories to the Principles for Responsible Investment. And all of those signatories are committing to, among other things, incorporating environmental, social, and governance, or ESG factors into all of their investment decisions. But again, the quality of the information available to them is very, very challenging to fulfill those commitments. So I say we have an elephant in the room because, as I'm sure many of you on the line are aware, we've seen historical CO2 levels from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes, just escalate tragically over time. So this is where we were in 1988, which is when the IPCC panel was established. I would say, just as kind of another marker that I don't have on here, it was 1975 that those investors petitioned the SEC for improved disclosure on ESG, and were told no, but it wasn't called ESG back then. In 2010, the SEC did issue guidance on climate change disclosure, and that was sort of an unheard of thing back in the day. Unfortunately, here we are in 2021. The SEC has sought public comment on climate change disclosure, and that's also a very big deal. I think there's a sense of urgency among some SEC commissioners more than others, but at the SEC to really put some teeth on the 2010 recommendations. And their call for public comment on climate change disclosure is really to establish an administrative record for potential rulemaking on this. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. So what does this have to do with SASB? It has a lot to do with SASB. I'll tell you a little bit more about us in a moment, but this is an overview. Every presentation has an eye chart. So this is yours. Sorry about this. It's hard to read, but I can share this with the group if you're interested in reading this. It's from our technical bulletin on climate risk. And this is something that SASB produced in 2015 ahead of while the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD, was established by Mark Carney and a former chair of the Bank of England. TCFD recommendations have been adopted among many jurisdictions around the world. Some are mandating TCFD reporting. Anyway, the TCFD recommendations were largely informed by SASB's research, which shows that climate risk is ubiquitous. It touches nearly every industry among the 77 industries for which SASB sets standards, but it manifests itself quite differently from one industry to another. So sort of cutting to the chase, who are we? Like, what are we doing? That was our technical bulletin on climate risk, but that is drawn from SASB's work, setting industry-specific standards for 77 industries across all the sectors of our economy. They are being used by companies and investors around the world, and we really exist to help dampen noise in information for companies to communicate with their investors on issues that are related to sustainability and things that impact society, but that also are likely to come back and affect the financial condition, the operating performance, or the market valuation of a company in a given industry. Our theory of change is that if you can influence the allocation of capital and give investors a better lens on how companies are performing on these issues, you can really help investors understand the companies that are performing well, on these issues and improve performance over time. So even if a company is effectively a laggard and not doing a great job disclosing, that opens up a conversation for investors to say, right, we've seen your peers do X. We think that this is a way for you to improve your business. Sustainability, the big secret for many who don't really understand what a lot of sustainability practitioners do, it's about efficiency. It's about, in addition to improving societal outcomes, it also improves business performance in most cases. SASB's theory of change is also that you can incentivize companies to improve upon and compete upon performance on financially material sustainability issues and create a race to the top. So how this dovetails with TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, is that those recommendations call for companies to disclose what their governance, strategy, risk management, and targets and metrics related to climate risk management look like. And so it's a very elegant framework for helping boards of directors, for example, say, well, what is our governance? Do we have enough climate expertise on our board? What is our strategy for mitigating that risk? What risk management do we have in place to mitigate this risk? And then the targets and metrics are a very key component of TCFD recommendations because it helps investors really track, and also management track, whether or not they are holding true to their governance strategy and risk management of these issues. So this is demonstrative. The graph on the right here shows you that although this company, this fictitious company, says that the board has established an integrated sustainability review committee, that's all good. They're monitoring progress against goals and targets. That's excellent. We want to see that. In the strategy, you see that they've adopted a strategy in 2014 to diversify their energy supply mix, and that they're targeting 50% renewable energy mix by 2020, all excellent goals, fantastic. And that the company has implemented in risk management a risk mitigation plan to increase the relative mix of renewable energy to overall energy it consumes, which all sound great. But when you look at the targets and metrics in this fictitious company, you can see that in fact, their energy consumption is going up and their percentage of renewables in their portfolio is reducing. So that would open up a conversation for an investor to say, well, you told me that you were doing these things in your TCFD reporting on governance strategy and risk management, but the metrics show a different story. Now, there could be a very good reason for that, because this company may have just acquired a company with a dirty energy portfolio that they are going to clean up and turn around. That could be a huge opportunity. There could be a lot of upside there. But it could also tell a story that, well, actually they were disingenuous in their disclosure, and that what they said they were doing in terms of governance strategy and risk management isn't really playing out. So that's where the SEC comes in. As I mentioned, the SEC has opened up a call for public comment on climate change disclosure. And that, again, doesn't sound like some epic making move by the SEC, but it really is quite remarkable because the SEC hasn't really been doing much in this area. Again, from the 1970s to the present, they've had a very elliptical orbit around these issues and whether or not they should take action. One of the reasons for this is that under US securities laws, there is something called Regulation SK, which already says that if something is financially material, a company should be disclosing it to its investors. So the SEC has sort of said, well, yeah, I mean, if it's material, a company would already be disclosing it. But what we've seen, over the years is that our understanding of these issues has really improved. And we see that they likely are financially material to many companies, but a lot of companies are really, really trying to figure out how to go about disclosing this information, how to collect the data. So for the SEC to call for public comment on climate disclosure opens the door up for other potential SEC action. And it does, as I mentioned, help the SEC establish an administrative record for potentially rulemaking on this topic. So this is Allison Heron-Lee. She was acting chair of the SEC up until the approval of Gary Gensler, who has now taken on that role. But while Allison Heron-Lee was in that seat of acting chair, she, no pun intended, she kind of set the world on fire. She uh, put SEC staff on notice that they needed to cooperate with IOSCO, which is the International Organization for Securities Commissioners around the world, to cooperate with international efforts to standardize this information. And SASB is a part of that working group. So I can't tell you how many things she changed in her short tenure as acting chair of the SEC. And I should also have given mention to Mary Shapiro, who was the SEC commissioner under whose authority the 2010 guidance on climate change disclosure was originally issued. So that's why the two of these women have played a really, really pivotal role in helping our financial system, our capital markets, really catch up with this problem that we have. So this is something that I like to say. I found this when I was pulling together some material for our investor advisory group. And it's really true that this present moment used to be the unimaginable future. And that can be good and bad. I mean, we should have taken action on climate decades ago. We didn't, and here we are. And we've got a very short runway to make this right for our kids and their kids and future generations. But it's also the unimaginable future that we see. Finally, we see what the Biden administration has called a full government approach to climate change, with all of the actions that we've seen coming out of the White House last week with their climate summit, commitments from the Treasury, commitments from tacitly through Acting Chair Lee, but with the establishment of a climate advisor at the SEC, which is a role that has never been there before. So we see a lot of positive change and potential for action. And so standards can change the world. Disclosure can change and drive capital to companies that are doing a better job of managing these things and get the attention of companies that aren't. And I really hope that this has all made sense to you. But that's kind of a really high level overview of SASB, why standards are important, and my whole journey in this space. So with that, I'd love to hear if anyone has any questions or comments.
Katie, thank you. The chat has been going crazy with everybody just saying how fantastic this presentation is and how informative it is. So thank you so much. We did have one question come in from Stephanie, and she was asking, how can investors more easily compare the qualitative measures that SASB asks? It's hard to do at scale today.
Qualitative is really challenging, and which is why we focus a lot on quantitative metrics, but qualitative disclosure is absolutely essential for establishing context. So we hear this a lot from companies like, well, if I disclose the data, but no one understands why, it's sort of the inverse of that slide that I was sharing with you about governance strategy and risk management. If that's all you have, you've only got qualitative, right? If you have the two of them together, you can understand, well, like, this is what you told me you were going to do. These are your plans, and this is how you're doing on that journey. So I can tell you that investors are getting very, very savvy about parsing out this information, as well as asking the right questions about the context. And that's, for me, the qualitative part of it is all about context. So bringing that to scale, I would say that investors each have their own sort of secret sauce for doing that. I would say that most investors who've been at this for a while are really diverging from the use of the ratings and rankings that I shared with you, that dog's breakfast slide, and really are disaggregating the underlying data to make their own assessment of how a company is performing on that. And the context part of that, the qualitative part of that, has a lot to do with how they're going about it. But you're right, bringing that to scale is hugely challenging, which is why this is different from financial reporting, which we have international GAAP, we have US GAAP, nobody questions that, everybody follows it. Financial reporting is comparatively quite simple, right? Because it's hard to argue about revenues, although some people will, try to cook the books. But hopefully that answers the question. But it's not it's not a layup by any stretch of the imagination.
Fantastic. My goodness. There's so many coming in so quickly. Next up is from Linda, and she asks, do you think the mutual funds that are focused on ESG are doing a good job? How do we distinguish between the ones that are doing a good job versus those that are trading on investors that want this?
Right. I think that it's hard to say that writ large, they're all doing a great job. Some are doing a better job than others, and they are there are varying levels of sophistication. There is a huge, and among other SEC actions, by the way, is was a I can't remember what they call it. It's not an action memo, but there's another official name for it. But they basically, shot across the bow a week or two ago to investment fund managers, asset managers, to say the way you're labeling some of your funds might be a little sketchy when it comes to these things. We want to see more about what's under the hood there. We have heard that many asset managers have simply relabeled some of their existing funds as ESG funds or sustainable investing funds. And the SEC is taking note of that, as is, by the way, the European Commission. I didn't talk anything about the broader regulatory landscape and how quickly it is moving, but the European Commission is really leading the charge on this. And there is something called the SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Requirements, I think, SFDR. And that is really asking fund managers to label their funds as, sort of light green, dark green. To be in a dark green fund, you have to meet all kinds of criteria. They're also asking for the disclosure of what they're calling principal adverse impacts. So they are really, really way ahead of the curve when it comes to moving the regulatory landscape along, but it's challenging. So I would say if you are a retail investor and you are interested in investing in a green fund, really do your homework and, try to find out, like, did this fund exist 10 years ago and it was called just another name? And what have you done if you have relabeled it? What are the criteria by which you're saying that it's climate neutral or green or sustainable? It's a fast moving landscape and challenging to keep up with.
Wonderful. We had Rachel just pop in to say that this has all been very compelling and informative, and she loves the analogies as an engineer. She said, who knew standards were so entertaining? Thank you.
I know, right? Thank you.
I knew it would be popular. Helen threw out a question and then got several plus ones with a few additions to it. So Helen's saying she'd love to ask about the merging and potential merging of standards to simplify reporting. And then Tucker added to a little bit, the world of reporting is getting a bit crowded, financial and beyond, before any of it is perfected. Is there much effort to consolidate or simplify different processes by different organizations or agenda agencies?
Yeah, emphatically yes. And that's one of the most encouraging and exciting things about this wonky world of standards and frameworks that I can share with you. The last 18 months have been really, really, we've made tons of progress on that. So we've been working on this for many, many years at SASB, but you have to have a tango partner to dance with. And it wasn't until the last 18 months or so that other standard setters and frameworks sort of recognized, excuse me, I have the hiccups, the need for us to harmonize across the space. So in September of 2020, SASB, the International Integrated Reporting Council, or IIRC, GRI, CDP, and the CDSB, which is the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, which is a sort of a sub of CDP, got together and produced a report that was essentially, it has a much longer title, but it was a joint statement declaring that we were going to collaborate, help harmonize, help create a common language across those frameworks, and dispel the notion of alphabet soup, which often gets sloshed around as a description for this landscape, which is arguably pretty sloppy and very crowded. But that if you looked at it from the perspective of which audience are you trying to communicate with and what tools are available to you, they slot together much more like building blocks than they do soup. You can also put them in soup, but I wouldn't recommend it. So that paper really helped establish kind of, it was like a public declaration that we were working together, that we had put together a common graphic that we all use, which is what we refer to as a system of nested and dynamic materiality, which I can go into further detail if you're interested. But many of the people on today's call are probably familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, which SASB is not competing with, but many people think we are. But GRI really is designed to report on impact. What is a company's impact on the rest of the world? When SASB set our standards, we looked at the GRI standards and we said, impact is very, very important, but investors need to know what also can come back amongst that swirling array of things that have impact. What can also come back at the industry level and affect the financial condition, operating performance, or market valuation of a company in a given industry, so that they could help start like their analysis there, and then think about impacts more in the context of context. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to do that. But so there is tremendous activity amongst what is now affectionately referred to as the group of five: SASB, IIRC, CDP, CDSB. Who am I leaving out? GRI. So that was in September. In December of last year, the same group issued what we refer to as a prototype climate standard. And that was in response to the IFRS trustees, who are the sort of parents of International GAAP through IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board. They issued a consultation in December of last year saying, we're hearing that investors really want better information on this, and we're wondering if we should wade into the space and establish a sustainability standards board, not to be confused with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. The response that they got to that consultation was an overwhelming yes, that there is tremendous support for and market pull for IFRS to establish SSB, the Sustainability Standards Board. They are not, however, reinventing the wheel. They have made it really clear that they intend to build upon the work of others. They are taking an enterprise value, an enterprise creation view of this, focused on the investor audience. And they are very intentionally pulling SASB, IIRC together in our newly merged entity, the Value Reporting Foundation, which I can talk about in a moment, into that working group that the IFRS is establishing when they set up the SSB. CDP and GRI are observers to that group. The World Economic Forum is a member of that working group. So there is tremendous activity saying the direction of travel is clearly a global standard for the disclosure of this information, but they are not reinventing the wheel, which could freak some people out to say, oh my God, not another one. What they are aiming to do is to pull in the work of the relevant standards and frameworks that are out there, including TCFD, to establish a global set of standards for companies to use in their disclosure. So help is on the way. It's probably a long, I don't want to say slow burning fuse, but in the meantime, SASB and IIRC are merging to form the Value Reporting Foundation to really help rationalize the space, take one player off the field. SASB standards will not go away. The integrated reporting framework won't go away, but will be like, you'll deal with one organization instead of two. And we're working very closely with GRI to help with the establishment of what we call interoperability between our standards, their standards, so that companies who are in the reporting space can do the old sort of the analogy to this old house, like, or any carpenter would tell you, measure twice, cut once. In this case, it would be like measure it once, but you can report it out to different entities depending on which audience and what your intention is for the communication. So help is on the way, but it is a very, very crowded space. Sorry, I rambled there a little bit.
No, that's fantastic. Got more questions coming in. So we had two questions sort of tied to greenwashing. So Katerina asks, how does SASB avoid greenwashing funds in its standards?
Avoid greenwashing funds in our standards?
Yeah, that's what it says.
Well, I'll tell you how we help investors reduce the probability that they are being greenwashed in a company's disclosure. It's kind of flipping that around a little bit, and I'm not sure if that's what they meant, but
Well,
if
that might actually tie in because I've got another one that says, is it possible to detect greenwashing by reading disclosures, or should we correlate information in disclosure with other metrics?
yeah.
What
So
are those
metrics are
metrics?
really essential in my view to, and standards, right, are essential to spotting greenwashing. So this slide that I'll pop back to, this one, this is like, whoop, alarm, alarm. You said you were going to do this, but actually it's not happening. Without the metrics, the targets and metrics part of this disclosure, it would be, you could easily be like, wow, this company's got it. They've got a board oversight of this. They've got this clear strategy and risk management. It sounds really great. But without the metrics and targets, you can't tell if they're actually doing what they said they would do. One of the things that I think has been unfortunate about the way that sustainability reporting has grown up over the years is that it's really well intentioned. It's trying to communicate to a bunch of different audiences. Some are, like your employees want to know how you're doing these, how you're managing these issues. Your obviously your stakeholders, communities in which a company operates, social license to operate is all tied to this. So obviously, companies want to tell like the good news story. I think that there's been an unfortunate um, pattern amongst some sustainability reporting is that the goalposts move every year. Like you set targets and goals and then like you make it over them and then you set new ones that are easily achieved instead of saying, you know what, this is our 10-year goal. And obviously not every, like many companies are absolutely doing the right thing and are doing a great job of disclosure, but some, it's been a little bit of like smoke and mirrors. So I think standards are necessary for helping spot greenwashing. One of our investor advisory group members in Japan, just blurted out on a webinar recently. She's like, if I see another company telling me that they're managing all 17 of the sustainable development goals, and they're a small to medium enterprise that is native to Japan, like how is that even possible, right? So she's immediately like honing in on like that doesn't make any sense, but it's hard. So you need targets and metrics. You need standardized disclosure. Otherwise, it's very challenging to determine whether or not someone's telling you a great story, but not actually walking their talk.
Awesome. All right, next up, I will get this name wrong. So Snahal, I apologize if I butchered that. Says it's so exciting to hear about SASB IRC getting merged together in mid 2021. Would you be able to talk about the Value Reporting Foundation and how that would contribute to a more uniform sustainability reporting process?
You guys are asking the best questions. Yeah, great question. So the Value Reporting Foundation is set to be merged. SASB and IRC will be merged at the end of this month, beginning of June. And that is really designed to, again, put under one roof the IIRC framework, as well as the whole principles of integrated thinking, which in my view, if every company followed, we wouldn't be on this webinar today because you'd have thought through like, oh, this is a problem. We shouldn't do this, or we should do something differently. But so integrated thinking, integrated reporting framework, as well as the SASB standards under one roof. Some people ask us whether or not we are competing with the IFRS trustees and their establishment of the SSB, and it could not be farther from the truth. We are really coming together to help them as they set up the SSB. We think of ourselves in a way as a bridge or a stepping stone on that longer journey to a global comprehensive system of corporate reporting. So when we did that paper that I mentioned to you in September of last year, it became really apparent as we were looking at all the building blocks or puzzle pieces amongst the standards and frameworks that some of them were more like each other than others. So SASB and IIRC are both focused on the investor as an audience. We are both focused on enterprise value creation, or hopefully the avoidance of destruction. And they're very complementary in that the IIRC has an integrated reporting framework, but no standards, and SASB has standards, but without a governing framework aside from our conceptual framework through which we set standards. So they really come together in a nice way for companies to think through how they're managing capitals on, as enterprises should be doing and creating value. And then similar to how we fit nicely together with TCFD, underpinning that narrative and that context with standards that can show, and here's the progress that we're making. So it's really exciting. We think it's going to be a huge advancement, and also help, one step on a multi-step journey of rationalizing this space. We also have a webinar later today, if anyone's interested in learning more about it, that I can send out to the group. A webinar we're going to be talking about the Value Reporting Foundation with our CEO and the CEO of IARC later today. But it's in the evening Pacific time, so that we could get more participants from Asia Pacific. But I'm happy to share that with anyone if you're interested in joining.
I'm sure based on the chat interest that there would be some folks interested in that. So Katie, if you want to send that information to me, we can drop that in the Slack channel.
Yes. Okay.
Sure. Well, if you've still got a few minutes, Katie, I've got a few more questions.
Sure.
All right. This comes from Stacy. She says, do you believe there needs to be more explicit distinction between ESG and climate investing to help avoid more greenwashing checkbox approaches? We've noticed a trend towards ESG as a blanket segment, but not enough widespread understanding that the E is not simply what the asset investment does to the environment, but also what the environment climate poses to the risk of the asset.
Yeah, resoundingly yes. And that's pretty much what the analysis that I'm sharing with you here is a snapshot of, and I'll also share the climate risk technical bulletin with you all if you're, for anyone who's interested, because it's really analysis at the industry level of the physical transition and regulatory risk of climate on companies in those industries. So exactly what you're talking about there, about how it comes back and can affect, companies in a given industry, not to mention the fact that the degradation of the environment and, the climate crisis that we're all facing. So, in an unfortunate way, like to get people's attention on, in many cases, you have to show them like, here's how this is good for you. And if a company goes, whoa, I didn't realize that I really had this kind of physical exposure, this physical risk exposure, it will hopefully, snap them into focus to say, right, okay, what am I doing to manage this? So this is, again, I apologize for the eye chart, but the 3 different columns here are, the blue is physical risk, the green is transition risk, and the purple is regulatory risk. And you can see some industries are exposed to all 3, some are exposed to just 1 or 2. But this is really meant to be kind of like a map, and the climate risk technical bulletin goes into much greater detail about how an investor would say, right, okay, understanding my portfolio, like net zero isn't really enough. You have to really understand, like, how can I work with these companies to help them understand how they should start mitigating this risk? And if they're not, do I really want them in my portfolio? So, it's definitely a problem, and but we're aiming to help sort of sharpen the focus on that.
Great. Shira put the link for that webinar in the chat, and we'll also
Thank you, Shira. One thing off my list. Hey, Shira, can you also put a link to the climate risk technical bulletin while you're at it? I didn't know you were on the line. Yay.
There you go. And then JC is going to also put that in the Slack channel as well. So that we'll have a few places you can find it. Okay, moving right along. This is from Cindy. Are there any RFPs out related to the work to coordinate standards?
Well, none that I can think of, but I think if you think about the work that the IFRS trustees are doing, I mean, that's like one of the biggest RFPs you could imagine. And they're not putting out a request for proposals. They're saying, we're going to do this. This is our plan. And a little bit more on that. They're aiming to have a clear roadmap for their plan moving forward to establish the SSB by COP26. So that's their target. So that's just happening. The other thing that's sort of like, this is the direction of travel, is definitely coming out of the European Commission. So before the SEC woke up and said, well, we should probably take a look at this, the European Commission was way ahead of everyone else in initially with their what used to be called the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and which last week was renamed the Corporate Reporting I'll never get this right, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So they have rightly renamed this directive because these things are financial over time. They're not non-financial, which has always bothered us. But the CSRD, in concert with the SFDR, which I talked about previously about what's in your portfolio, what are your principal adverse impacts? Is it a green, a light green, or a dark green portfolio? Those two things together with the European taxonomy on sustainable finance are really an EC economy-wide approach to tackling these things. So no RFPs out there, but there's no question in my mind that the clear direction of travel is mandated disclosure on these things, and that the standard setters, like IFRS, have said we're going to build on the existing work that's done. If anyone wants to get involved in SASB's standard setting process, we have an ongoing array of over 10 research and standard setting projects and others that will surely follow as we maintain that we want to keep the standards evergreen as issues emerge, as we find that we should refine the standards that are existing. So you can find out all of the standard setting projects that are away, the research projects that are underway on our website, as well as how to get involved in those. So we don't have an RFP on that, but it's an open, transparent, rigorous due process on standard setting for us.
Awesome. All right, I've got two more in the queue at this point. So this comes from Liz. She says, Katie, what a great presentation. We've discussed federal regulations, but as a real estate professional, I'm interested in the regulatory landscape on the state and local level. Cities have tied development funds, tax breaks to compliance with certain sustainable building standards, the Green Building Council, the International Living Future Institute, et cetera. Has SASB worked with any non-federal jurisdictions in connection with disclosure requirements for companies receiving government funds?
Another great question. So we've worked with the insurance commissioner of the state of California. That's one that springs to mind. And there is a new initiative that they have launched that we're a part of in the state of California. Otherwise, I'm sure we have been in touch, but I don't know the depth of our interaction with municipalities. One thing that I think it's absolutely the right question to ask yourself. And I think the insurance industry is a very, you could think of them as a canary in the coal mine. We need another analogy for that because we don't want coal mines anymore. But they are taking the hits when we have climate related natural disasters. And we see even in in places where we have not been subject to or haven't experienced wildfires, where insurance is now impossible to get because of the risk of wildfire related to climate, among other things. So insurance companies are really rethinking how they're managing all of these risks and the risks they're willing to take and the risks they're not willing to take. And you see property values declining in coastal regions that are now slowly, even on high tide, king tide days, flooding, even before the sea level rise that we're expecting with melting ice caps and so on. So short answer is I don't know beyond the California Insurance Commissioner's Office whom we've interfaced with. But you're asking all the right questions, and it's the old back in the early days when I started this journey, it was the old think locally, act globally, and thinking locally is like hugely important when it comes to talking with your city councils, so on and so forth. Do you really want to add more parking, or would a bike lane be better? Those kinds of conversations needs to happen at the local level, the municipal level.
Wonderful. And I think we'll end on this last one and wrap it up a little bit early. This is from Reagan, and she says, what are the biggest barriers to harmonizing metrics?
Right. Biggest barriers to harmonizing metrics are, developing a common taxonomy. So for example, SASB and GRI both have standards. SASB standards are industry specific. Most GRI standards are cross industry. They do have some industry focused standards, but not as many as we do. And we might be, sort of getting back to that slide about 50 companies using 24 different ways to talk about employee health and safety. I would say that there are probably we're talking about similar things, but not with the same language. So that's an ongoing project that we need to undertake with GRI to develop a common taxonomy across our, just those two standards, not to mention, ISO and, I don't want to start burying you in acronyms, but those are just two of the big players that need to harmonize. And then from there and there and there. So we need to be able to help companies, again, measure it once, report it out to different audiences. But right now they're having to kind of measure it in different ways because there isn't that harmonization. So that's a barrier that we need to tackle. And bear in mind that SASB and GRI, as are all of the standard setters that I've mentioned in today's webinar, they're all nonprofits. So we're not like thousands of people, like with armies, at the ready to yeah, why don't we harmonize? It takes a lot of time. And as you can imagine, with our industry specific standards for 77 industries, they on average have 6 disclosure topics and 13 metrics per industry. So that's like thousands of things that we need to harmonize with whoever we're harmonizing with. So it's a big lift.
That's fantastic. We are at the top of the hour. I think you've covered all the questions that came in. Thank you all so much for the great questions, for being so engaged in this. Katie, on behalf of Women in Climate Tech, thank you so much. I think this was a fantastic presentation. I know it's raised a lot of good questions, and hopefully it'll continue some discussion within our Slack group. And certainly if anyone still has any outstanding questions, you can shoot it to us in the Slack or email it over and we can get it to Katie, or you're welcome to reach out. Helen, I don't know if you have anything you want to say in closing.
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much. And Lisa, if you want to unmute and introduce yourself as well.
Oh, I'll allow it. I'll allow it, Lisa.
Sorry.
Got it locked down.
Want to speak, but can't. No, it's really great. Thank you so much, Katie. And I'm so sorry that I had to join late. I was actually speaking on another panel, but I'm really, really happy that it sounds like this was just such a hit, and really appreciate your time. Thank you so, so much.
I'm so grateful. Thank you for the opportunity. And I'm sorry, I mentioned this before. I'm terrible at looking at the chat while I'm presenting. So I'm sorry if anyone was asking me a question that I didn't answer. But my email address is easy to remember. It's katie@sasb.org. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to follow up. And, carry on, everyone. We've got mountains to climb, but with so many powerful women and smart women on the line, I've no doubt that, we can get this done.